November 20th, 1943. The Central Pacific. Tarawa Atoll. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki stood in his command post on the island of Betio and told his staff something that he believed with complete conviction and that the next 76 hours would prove catastrophically wrong. 1,000,000 men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. Shibasaki had reason for confidence. Betio was a small island, barely 2 miles long and half a mile wide, a sliver of coral and sand sitting at the southwestern corner of Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands. What it lacked in size, it possessed in fortification. Shibasaki had spent months transforming Betio into what Japanese military engineers called an unsinkable battleship, a defensive position so thoroughly reinforced and so completely integrated with the island's terrain that any attacking force would be destroyed before it could establish itself ashore. The numbers of the defensive work were staggering for an island of Betio size. 14 coastal defense guns ranging from 8-inch naval rifles to smaller weapons that covered every approach to the island from the sea. 40 anti-aircraft guns. 25 artillery pieces. More than 500 machine gun positions, each one positioned to cover the beach approaches with interlocking fields of fire. 14 tanks buried to their turrets in defensive positions. Bombproof command posts built from coconut logs, coral sand, and captured British naval guns with walls so thick that they had shrugged off naval gunfire tests that should have destroyed them. And the obstacle that Shibasaki had not built but that nature had provided in perfect complement to everything his engineers had constructed. The reef. Betio was surrounded by a coral reef that extended several hundred yards from the beach at low tide, a natural barrier that would strand any landing craft that attempted to cross it when the water over the reef was insufficient for their draft. American planners had calculated that there would be 5 feet of water over the reef at high tide on November 20th, enough for the Higgins boats that would carry the Marines to the beach. A naval expert who had worked in the Pacific, Major Frank Holland, warned that the tides in the Tarawa area were unpredictable and that a neap tide condition could reduce the water over the reef to 3 feet or less, stranding the landing craft hundreds of yards from shore. The warning was not given sufficient weight. The planning proceeded with the 5-foot estimate. The Marines who came in the first waves would discover within the first hour that Holland had been right. The 2nd Marine Division, which would assault Betio, was commanded by Major General Julian Smith, a Marine officer who had been preparing his division for amphibious assault for months with the knowledge that the Central Pacific Campaign would require exactly this kind of operation. Smith's division was experienced and well-trained, but none of its men had participated in a contested amphibious assault against a prepared defensive position of the kind that Betio represented. The doctrine that the Marine Corps had been developing since the 1920s was about to face its first true test against a determined enemy who had prepared specifically to defeat it. The naval bombardment that preceded the landing on Betio was the heaviest that the Pacific War had yet produced. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers fired for 3 hours at an island 2 miles long and half a mile wide. Carrier aircraft added bombs and rockets to the shells. The smoke and dust that rose from the island obscured it completely from the observation planes overhead. Officers aboard the fire support ships watching the bombardment believed they were watching the destruction of every defensive position on the island. They were wrong. The bomb-proof shelters that Shibasaki's engineers had built were doing what they had been designed to do. The Japanese defenders who had survived the bombardment in their shelters emerged when the firing stopped and manned their weapons before the first landing craft reached the beach. The first sign that the assault was going wrong came before the Marines even reached the reef. The Higgins boats grounded on the coral at what their cruise depth soundings confirmed was approximately 3 feet of water, precisely the worst-case scenario that Major Holland had predicted. The boats were stuck hundreds of yards from the beach, well within range of every Japanese weapon on the island, completely unable to move. The Marines had 2 choices. They could stay in the boats and die, or they could get out and wade. They got out and waded. The wade from the grounded boats to the beach across the reef was the most lethal crossing of the Pacific War. Japanese machine gunners who had survived the bombardment in their shelters had pre-registered their weapons on the reef, because Shibasaki had understood that the reef was the killing ground where an attacking force would be most vulnerable. The men who climbed out of the grounded Higgins boats and began wading toward the beach were walking into fire from dozens of machine gun positions that covered the crossing from multiple angles simultaneously. Men died by the hundreds on the reef. There was no cover. There was no concealment. There was only the water, which was waist-deep or chest-deep depending on where a man was standing on the uneven coral, and the fire coming from the beach, and the choice between continuing to wade forward and dying in the water. The Marines waded forward. The ones who reached the beach found a narrow strip of sand between the water and a coconut log seawall that the Japanese had built as an obstacle but that the Marines immediately adopted as their only cover. The seawall was approximately 4 feet high and provided protection from direct fire from the beach interior while the men behind it were crouching, but it was also the edge of the killing zone. Getting over the seawall meant exposing yourself to fire from positions that had been covering the beach for hours while you were pinned behind the wall. The Marines went over the wall. The assault on Betio was not a coordinated military operation in the conventional sense. It could not be, because the communications that coordination required had been disrupted by the same chaos that had disrupted everything else. Company commanders who had planned specific routes to specific objectives found themselves leading whatever men had made it to the beach nearest to them toward whatever objective was achievable with the forces available. The formal operational plan that had been developed over weeks of preparation was replaced within the first hour by the improvised leadership of small unit commanders who understood that forward was the only direction that offered any possibility of survival. Colonel David Shoup, commanding the assault forces on Red Beach, was wounded twice in the first hours and continued commanding from the beach. His radio still worked, which made him the most important communications node on the island for much of the first day. He directed reinforcements, coordinated fire support, and maintained the command presence that the assault required at a moment when the organized command structure had been disrupted by casualties and communications failures. Shoup sent a message to division headquarters late on the first day that became one of the most famous communications of the Pacific War. Casualties many. Percentage dead not known. Combat efficiency we are winning. He was right. The percentages were terrible. The efficiency was doubtful. They were winning. Slowly and at a cost that was exceeding every estimate, but winning. The second day on Betio was different from the first in a way that reflected the particular arithmetic of the Pacific War's island battles. The first day had been a test of whether the Marines could get ashore and survive. They had passed the test at a cost that would shock the American public when the casualty figures were released. The second day was about whether the Marines who had survived could push inland and begin the systematic destruction of the Japanese defensive network. The Marine Corps doctrine for assaulting prepared positions specified the combined use of infantry, tanks, and engineers to destroy individual positions one at a time. The tanks that should have been available to support the infantry on the first day had been delayed by the same reef problems that had stranded the Higgins boats, but they came ashore on the second day and their presence immediately changed the tactical situation. A Japanese machine gun position that had been killing Marines who tried to cross an open stretch of beach became vulnerable to a tank that could approach from an angle the position's firing arc did not cover and eliminate it with a single shot. The flamethrowers were the other weapon that made the difference on Betio, as they would make the difference at Iwo Jima and Peleliu in the months that followed. Bunkers and bombproof shelters that could not be taken by rifle fire or grenades could be silenced by a Marine who was willing to carry the flamethrower tanks across open ground under fire and direct burning fuel into the position's opening. The men who did this understood the risk in the specific way that frontline soldiers understand risks that they have seen kill other men, and they did it anyway because the alternative was leaving the position intact to kill more Marines. The Japanese defensive system on Betio was extraordinary in its construction but limited in its flexibility. The positions had been built to cover specific firing arcs and to resist attack from specific directions. When Marines flanked a position or attacked it from a direction it had not been designed to cover, its effectiveness was dramatically reduced. The same engineering precision that made the positions formidable from the expected directions made them vulnerable from the unexpected ones. Japanese soldiers who emerged from their positions to counterattack found themselves in the open against Marines who had been trained for exactly this contingency. The counterattacks that Shibasaki ordered on the second and third days were repulsed with casualties that the Japanese garrison could not sustain at the same rate as the Marine assault. By the morning of November 22nd, the third day, the organized Japanese resistance on Betio was collapsing. Not because the Marines had destroyed every defensive position, because they had not. Not because the Japanese defenders had exhausted their will to fight, because they had not. The collapse came because the Japanese command structure had been destroyed, because Shibasaki himself had been killed, because the communications that allowed individual positions to coordinate their fire and their movement had been cut by the systematic elimination of the senior officers who maintained those communications. On the night of November 22nd, the remnants of the Japanese garrison made their final counterattack, approximately 300 soldiers coming out of their last defensive positions in the darkness in a final act of defiance that the Marines met with rifle fire and machine guns and grenades. By dawn on November 23rd, it was over. Betio was secure. The accounting of what 76 hours on Betio had cost was conducted in the days that followed, and the numbers were so stark that the Marine Corps debated how much of the information should be released to the American public. In 76 hours of fighting on an island 2 miles long, the 2nd Marine Division had suffered 3,301 casualties, including 1,009 killed. The Marine Corps had never suffered casualties at this rate in any previous engagement. Of Shibasaki's garrison of approximately 4,700 men, 17 Japanese soldiers were taken prisoner. The rest died fighting. Also killed were 129 Korean laborers who had been forced to build the defenses and had no part in the fighting. The man who had said 1,000,000 men could not take Tarawa in 100 years had been wrong by a factor that was difficult to comprehend. Fewer than 20,000 Marines had taken it in 76 hours. He had also been wrong about what the cost would be, because the cost to the Marines was higher than any previous Pacific assault had produced, and the lessons of Betio would be studied and applied to every subsequent amphibious operation in the Pacific. The primary lesson was the LVT, the landing vehicle tract, commonly called the Amtrak or the Alligator. A small number of LVTs had been used in the Tarawa assault, and their performance had been the critical difference between the men who reached the beach alive and the men who died on the reef. The LVT could cross the reef regardless of the water depth, driving on its tracks across coral that stopped conventional landing craft, and delivering its men to the beach without the lethal way that had cost so many lives on the first day. After Tarawa, every major Pacific amphibious operation used LVTs in sufficient numbers to carry the assault waves across whatever reef or obstacle separated the landing craft from the beach. The Marines who died on the reef at Betio died for a lesson that saved thousands of lives in the operations that followed. The second lesson was the preliminary bombardment, which had been massive and had destroyed almost nothing of military consequence. After Tarawa, the systematic destruction of specific defensive positions rather than the area bombardment that had been used at Betio became standard procedure for pre-landing naval gunfire. Spotters worked more carefully. Targets were identified precisely. The bombardment that preceded Iwo Jima, while still insufficient in many respects, was directed at specific positions rather than at the island as a whole. Colonel Shoup received the Medal of Honor for his command on Red Beach. So did Lieutenant William Hawkins, who died leading his scout sniper platoon in systematic attacks on Japanese defensive positions that cleared the way for the infantry behind him. So did Staff Sergeant William James Bordelon, who destroyed 4 Japanese emplacements and continued fighting while severely wounded before dying from his wounds. So did First Lieutenant Alexander Bonnyman Jr., who led a frontal assault on a fortified Japanese command bunker with a handful of men and died on its roof after reaching the top of the position. For Medals of Honor in 76 hours on an island 2 miles long. The men who earned them were representative of what Betio had asked of every Marine who came ashore on November 20th, 1943, because every man who waded across that reef from a grounded Higgins boat was doing something that the odds said should not be survivable and doing it because there was no other way to get to the beach. The photographs that were taken on Betio in the hours after the fighting ended showed the island's beaches in a way that the American public had not previously seen from any Pacific battle. The bodies of Marines who had been killed on the reef and on the beach were still there, because the fighting had been too intense and the timeline too compressed to recover them during the battle. The photographs showed what the amphibious assault on a prepared defensive position actually looked like, what the cost of taking Betio had actually been, and the American public, which had been told that the Pacific War was going well, saw something that required a different kind of understanding. The Marine Corps, initially inclined to restrict the photographs because of their impact on public morale, eventually released them. The decision was made that the American people deserved to understand what was being done in their name and at what cost. The photographs from Betio changed the way Americans understood the Pacific War in ways that photographs from previous battles had not. The men who fought at Tarawa understood something about war that the photographs could suggest but not fully convey. The 76 hours on Betio were 76 hours of the most concentrated violence that the Pacific War produced in any equivalent period, and the men who survived them carried the experience as veterans always carry their most extreme experiences, as something that defined them permanently and that could not be fully communicated to anyone who had not been there. Private First Class James Grose of the 2nd Marines was 20 years old when he waded across the reef at Betio. He was one of the men who made it. He was asked decades later what he wanted people to understand about Tarawa. "I want them to understand that we were scared," he said. "Every man on that reef was scared. The ones who say they weren't scared are lying to you. We were scared and we kept going anyway. That's what being a Marine is. Not being without fear. Going forward when you're afraid." They went forward. On the reef at Betio on November 20th, 1943, in water that was waist deep and then chest deep and then over their heads for some of them, in fire that came from dozens of positions that covered every inch of the crossing, they went forward. And they took the island that 1,000,000 men in 100 years were supposed to be unable to take. It took them 76 hours.